From the Australian National University College of Law, this is Law and Crisis, bringing you interdisciplinary perspectives on the questions we're confronting today that will shape our future. In this episode, Professor Desmond Manderson explores questions of legal controls in times of crisis with Professor David Dyzenhaus.
Welcome to today's edition of Law and Crisis, and I think this series would not be complete without speaking to David Dyzenhaus, who's a person who has spent his whole career really thinking about questions of legality and legitimacy of law, particularly in situations of crisis and emergency. And that work has involved both historical studies, notably of the Weimar Republic, and more contemporary and far-reaching ways of thinking about this issue. David is a professor in the Faculty of Law, university professor in the Faculty of Law at the University of Toronto, and is the author of many books and articles in legal theory and in law and political theory, I would say, as well. David, I wanted particularly to talk to you today about the work of Carl Schmitt. And my question to you is, why is it Carl Schmitt is a legal theorist from the Third Reich, amongst other places, although he had a very long career over many years. Why is Carl Schmitt so important for thinking about the way that law is used or developed in situations of emergency?
I think that Carl Schmitt is important for the reason that some people are a celebrity for being a celebrity. And it's not that I think that his thought about emergencies is profound, but many people think that his thought about emergencies is profound. And that's why it's important to engage with him. He put forward the most radical version of the view that in a time of emergency, there can be no legal controls. And he argued that for that view with great rigor. And he was kind of discovered in North America and elsewhere after 9/11, and went from being a fairly obscure figure to being a figure that's referred to actually just in the mainstream press, let alone by academics who wouldn't have referred to him a few years before. And so it's important to engage with him, I think only because he's there to be engaged with and is taken even by liberal theorists as providing a sound account of how law is incapable of responding to moments of existential crisis.
Right. So his point, I suppose, or if we could sort of think about two aspects of his thought. One is that the rule of law is incapable of preventing executive power, and in fact, nor should it. I mean, right? That's what he sort of says. It neither can nor should it prevent executive power taking over in situations of emergency where factual crises overrun the sort of normal processes of governance. And I guess, so maybe we could just stop at that. Is that how you understand his argument in those situations? The failure, the incapacity of the rule of law to deal with emergency?
Well, Schmitt is a deeply deceptive and I think a dishonest thinker. Yeah. And he often portrays his claim as a descriptive claim. So the claim is that if one looks back at the history of emergencies, one will find that during times of emergency, the law fails to respond. And if it does respond, the response is hollow. There's just a thin veneer of legality over substantive illegality, as an English judge once put it. So the thought seems to be, well, law just can't do any work during a time of emergency. But there is also, as I think you suggested in your question, a normative claim there. And that is, he supposes that law shouldn't respond in a time of emergency. And that's because he has a political agenda that he hopes to fulfill through emergencies.
Right, and that political agenda is something to do with the idea of the nation, or something to do even with an idea of justice, which he thinks law is incapable of getting at. And we need something more liberated, something more freed from control in order to achieve those ends?
In a way, yes. So there is an idea of the nation there, which is probably better conveyed by using this loaded German term of Volk, right? The German term for people. And Schmitt, in his work, talked about what he called substantive homogeneity. And he didn't think that one could have a sustainable political order unless it was based on a substantively homogeneous people. Once one had that in place, then actually law could do a lot of work. I think in many ways, Schmitt was a kind of disappointed legal positivist. Once you put in place substantive homogeneity, then you could use law as an instrument for imposing the vision of the people. But the liberal idea of the rule of law as a set of procedural constraints which might help us against state action if state action goes wrong.
Right.
That idea wanted nothing to do with.
Yeah. So we begin to see a connection between the idea of an emergency, which, as you said, Schmitt tries to present as a simple factual claim about the world. There are emergencies. There are ways in which facts, exceed our expectations of them. That law is never entirely adapted to the situation in which we find ourselves. But that is connected to a kind of an almost triumphalist claim about the ways in which that liberates visions of the future, and you talk about the language of Volk or about nationhood or people or something like that, from constraint, right? And so it becomes the ground for a much stronger and, as you point out, a much more dangerous kind of peril of what happens when you liberate not just executive power itself, but the language of populism, let's say, from constraint.
Yes, that's right. And for Schmitt, it's the case that we live in a secular democratic age. We cannot appeal anymore to legitimating factors that used to be taken for granted, like the divine right of kings. And so the people is the only place to which one can appeal. But he has a very particular understanding of the people. And it's when the executive puts forward a vision of the people and a substantial enough proportion of the population respond by saying yes, that one puts in place, according to him, authentic democracy. So his view is that the people can only acclaim. That's the role of the people in democracy.
You describe him as a thwarted positivist, but he's a thwarted and not even terribly thwarted absolutist, isn't he? Because there's a blurring there of democracy and populism in his way of thinking.
Well, there is a blurring there, but it is the case, I think, that those leaders whom we call populists, if one looks at those leaders, what they really want is power. And they will try to get significant enough support from the people in their country to win and then hold on to that power. And they don't really care all that much what the content of the political vision is that will appeal, as long as it will appeal. So I think it's rightly said of both Trump and Viktor Orban that they probably don't have any strongly held beliefs about what people should believe. What they want is people to believe in them. And so they will do whatever it takes. So it's populism in that sense. It's not something that really comes from the people out there. It's something that's projected. And then if there are enough people who are won over by this projection, then you have the link, which Schmitt thought of as authentic democracy.
Yeah, that's right. And what we begin to see is we can understand an emergency or a crisis as a kind of a factual situation that requires an extreme response, but we can also understand it as an opportunity for the advancement of all sorts of developments of government and non-governmental power. So although a lot of your work has been about the Weimar Republic, which might look to many people like ancient history, you write, and you alluded to in your last response, to the singular way in which modern rulers appear to have taken Schmitt's approach to law and power to heart in troubling ways. I wonder if you might say a little bit more about examples in which you see that Schmittian logic playing itself out in ways that we ought to be worried about.
Well, the two examples that I alluded to, that is Trump's America and Orban's Hungary, those are examples where one finds the executive trying to accrue more power and trying to hold on to the power that the executive accrues through appealing to a substantial segment of the population on a basis that makes the distinction, which Schmitt thought was the crucial distinction of politics, and that is a distinction between friend and enemy. So you divide the people who happen to live on your territory into two groups, the friends and the enemies, and you appeal only to those you regard as friends. And the worrying aspect of a public health emergency of the sort that we face now is that it does present these leaders with autocratic tendencies with an opportunity to accrue even more power in the circumstances where everyone feels threatened. But I don't think this is a phenomenon that by any means is confined to the USA or to Hungary. And I think that one can see something like the same kind of tendencies in the United Kingdom.
When listening to you speak, it occurs to me that there's two aspects of emergency that we need to pay attention to. One is its emotional content, which Schmitt, was right on to, the way in which it creates anxiety and insecurity in people, and the ways in which those anxieties and insecurities can be turned to account, to use by the language of populism and by the desires of executive powers to continue to stretch, right? So that's in a way the Schmittian kind of concern, or the Schmittian point. The other aspect is the extent to which emergencies might act as, how's the best way to put this, as kind of not distractions, but might distract people from other kinds of ways in which policy and governments are taking. So, for example, the ways in which the Keystone Pipeline has been pushed through by the US government at this moment because activism has been, reduced. People's ability to protest in public space have been reduced. Everyone is locked down, and there are certainly, interest in many countries, including your country and my country, who see this as an opportunity to advance their own economic and political interests at a moment when our attention is the other way.
I think there's almost an instinctive reaction on the part of many people and of their governments to think of this public health emergency, which seems to me the only way to think of it, as we're all in this together. So it's actually quite difficult to make the friend-enemy distinction in a public health emergency. And this is one reason why Democrats in the United States of America are, in a way, quite hopeful that this emergency will be the end of Trump, because his attempts to turn this into a kind of Schmittian emergency where you can make the friend-enemy distinction might fail in the face of the fact that the majority of people in America will think, no, that's not what's going on here. We're all in this together. And perhaps this explains why, given my very inexpert understanding of Australian politics, why a very conservative federal government or a very conservative provincial government in Ontario turns out to be no different from a middle-of-the-road or even left-wing government in responding to this emergency. in regard to the second part of your question or point, I do think that there are troubling trends in our time, and the Keystone Pipeline might well be one, right? So the Keystone Pipeline is very controversial in Canada and in the US, and the federal government is pushing ahead with it. And it is the case that it's easier for the federal government here to go ahead with that at a time when public protest isn't really possible. But I'm not so sure that in Canada this is particularly troubling at this time. But by which I mean that I think the federal government would have been doing this anyway. I don't think they're using the public health emergency as a cover for doing what they were going to do anyway. They announced that they were going to do this well before the public health emergency. They invested billions in buying the company that was supposed to be laying the pipe. And it's convenient for them that there can't be protests, but I think this would have been done anyway. If one looks at the United States of America, Trump is pushing ahead with his agenda when it comes to stripping environmental regulations and so on. But I think he would have been doing that anyway. It's just that right now people's attention is focused on something else, so it's a lot easier to get those things done.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. And going back, I suppose, to what you were saying a moment ago, I suppose this is what makes this a crisis. What makes it a crisis is we've got these two countervailing forces, right? We have many people around the world who are using the moment, the emotional lability of emergency as a way of weaponizing the friend-enemy distinction and really, pushing that on steroids, right? And at the same time, as you point out, for many people's experiences has been to evaporate the friend-enemy distinction, to create actually stronger senses of solidarity as opposed to stronger senses of division. And both of those forces seem to be exacerbated in some ways around the world. Which force will win is not clear, right? And that's what makes it a crisis, is that we don't actually know how this is going to play out in the end.
We don't, but perhaps there are some reasons for optimism in the midst of all of this miserable mess. So if one takes a country which I think you mentioned earlier on, Brazil, Bolsonaro is, I think, in Brazil doing what he would have done anyway. But the fact that he's doing what he would have done anyway at a time when people can see the effects of his attempts to weaponize a public health emergency might be the end of his time as president. And it might be the case that this is really trying to inject as much optimism into the current situation as possible. So going back to the example I mentioned earlier, right? Just a few months ago, the eyes of the world were on your country. Why? Because your federal government seemed to be doing such a miserable, making such a miserable attempt at dealing with the crisis posed by the fires that were devastating Australia, and seemed to be denying, in the face of incontrovertible evidence, climate change. This was just ordinary stuff that got a bit out of hand. Well, it might be more difficult, and at the same time trying to retreat from any real state intervention in these massive problems. It might be more difficult to do that after having dealt, assuming the world can successfully deal with this public health crisis. Put slightly differently, and this will reveal my political preferences as a social democrat, people might rediscover the worth of the state and of collective action.
I think that's a great point to make, and a good point on which to stop. I think I'll just say thank you very much for your contribution. It's been really lovely talking to you, and I hope you're doing well over there in Toronto. Thanks a lot, David.
Thank you, Des. Good night.
Good night.
Law in Crisis is produced by the ANU College of Law. If you're interested in navigating the challenges of this uncertain time, we offer a range of postgraduate degree programs taught by interdisciplinary experts. Start your journey today at law.anu.edu.au.